Hello again, Bio30 Prep. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the circulatory system again, and here we're going to be looking specifically at the circulation of blood. In your textbook, it's pages 272 to 281. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to describe the mechanisms regulating heart rate and blood volume. You'll be able to compare the function of pulmonary and systemic circulation. You'll describe the pathway of oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood, and you'll be able to identify the location where blood is oxygenated and deoxygenated. So where is it gaining oxygen and where is it losing that oxygen to? First, we'll look at the sounds of the heart. Here's a cross-section of the heart at the level of most of the valves that open and close between each of the vessels. Now, if you put a stethoscope up to your heart or even your ear up to somebody's chest, make sure you know them well before you do that, you'll hear this kind of lub-dub sound. It's the sound, and it comes from the closing of the heart valve. So as those heart valves close, they slam shut, and that's what makes the audible sound inside of the heart. Just like closing a door. When you close a door, when the door hits the door frame, it makes a sound. The AV valves, or the atrioventricular valves, are responsible for the first sound, the lub sound. As the ventricle contracts, it forces those valves closed. The semilunar valves are going to open when that ventricle contracts. So a ventricle contracts, it forces the AV valves closed, but it opens up the semilunar ones. When the ventricle relaxes, blood is going to want to flow back down into the ventricles, and that closes the semilunar valves, and that makes a deb sound. When the heart is relaxed, it's called diastole. When the heart contracts, it's called systole. And we're going to use these terms when we talk about blood pressure. So we'll write that in just so we don't forget. These are related to, we're going to see them again when we talk about blood pressure. Alright, and a murmur is a condition where the valves don't close properly or don't seal completely. So the valves open when blood's going through them. When they get closed, if there's any space, and so if we take a look at this picture, imagine this aortic semilunar valve or the semilunar valve. If these three pieces of the valve don't match up properly, there's going to be a space, and in that space, blood can leak back through into one of the chambers. So that's going to cause kind of a sucking sound, and that sucking or gurgling is what we hear as a murmur. Individuals with permanent murmurs, often you will see them in newborn babies, and it's just because their heart's a little underdeveloped. The valves haven't quite grown to a point where they're in full contact. So most heart murmurs, at least people who are born with murmurs, the murmur disappears. As the body gets bigger, the heart gets bigger and matures, and those valves seal off. Individuals with permanent murmurs tend to have slightly faster heart rates because to compensate for the backflow of blood, every contraction is a little less efficient than if the murmur wasn't there. The most common murmur is in the mitral valve, the AV valve, between the left ventricle and the left atrium, because it's withstanding the greatest amount of pressure. Every time that left ventricle contracts, it's putting tons of pressure on that valve. And so that's the one that's most likely to wear and have a murmur. So in the picture above, here's the bicuspid or mitral valve that is most prone to leaking. Again, you'll see there's a big space there. If that space doesn't fill up entirely, then you end up getting backflow of blood. And notice in this one, they've named the valves a little bit more than what we had before. Atrioventricular is all you really need to know. If you want to call it bicuspid or mitral, go right ahead. Notice that the other AV valve is called a tricuspid because it has three parts, or three cusps, to the valve. The aortic and the pulmonary semilunar valves, again, they're named because of the vessel they go into. Either name is acceptable for a test. Here's a picture just trying to show the flow of blood a little bit better. When the atria contract, so the atria are going to contract first, they force blood into the ventricles. So we force blood this way, and we force blood this way. The ventricles fill up. No sound is associated with that because nothing's being closed. When the ventricles contract, it's going to force blood in two directions. It's going to force it this way and this way. So in each ventricle, blood is being forced back up towards the valves. Now the AV valves are going to slam shut, thereby preventing blood from flowing back into the atriums, and that's the lub sound. That's the first sound. So it keeps blood from going backwards, and so all the blood gets forced up into arteries. This is the pulmonary artery. Here is our aorta, but it's being forced up into arteries. When those ventricles relax, these valves, the blood is going to want to flow backwards into those chambers. These valves are going to slam shut, these semilunar valves. They're going to slam shut, and that is what makes the dub sound. Those valves slam shut, preventing the backflow of blood. And this one here, just from the last slide, here's our mitral valve. And because that left atrium, or that left ventricle, sorry, because it's so muscular, because it's forcing blood throughout your entire body. The blood in that left ventricle has to go out to your head, your arms, the rest of your body, legs. So there's lots of pressure behind that blood, which means there's lots of pressure always slamming that mitral valve shut, which is why it's more prone to leaking. In terms of how does it happen, so how does all this heart contraction work? It's stimulated by nervous tissue. So the SA node sends out an electrical stimulus causing the atria to contract. So the SA node is right here. It's connected to your brain. And so your brain sends an impulse to the SA node. And the SA node lets that impulse travel through the atrium. You'll see they have these lines drawn here, both in the right atrium, and you can see it drawn across into the left atrium as well. So both atria contract at about the same time. And with this stimulus, the stimulus is going to reach the second yellow circle. This is called the AV node. When it reaches that AV node, a new impulse, or the impulse, is going to continue to be carried through the septum. And then here is where the contraction begins for the ventricles. So at the apex of the heart, at the bottom of the septum, the contraction of ventricles starts next. It's going to slam shut those AV valves, open up the semilunar valves, and push blood into the pulmonary artery and the aorta. Now, in terms of the tissue, when the stimulus reaches the AV node, it passes through something called the bundle of His, which is a bundle of nervous tissue at the top of the holy moly, septum. There's the word I was looking for. This whole structure is called the septum. At the top of the septum is the bundle of His. The impulse is carried down Purkinje fibers, and those Purkinje fibers are going to stimulate muscle contraction starting at the apex. The chordae tendineae are these stringy fibers here, and it's labeled on the diagram. There's one set. Here's another set. What they do, and notice they're attached to the AV valves. What these do is when the ventricles contract, there's tons of pressure pushing on the valves. These fibers are connective tissue that prevent the heart valves from inverting when the heart contracts. So when we look at the beating of the heart is composed of cardiac muscle or myogenic muscle. It's unique. The muscle in the rest of your body is not the same as the muscle that your heart is made of. It's the only type of muscle that can contract without direct nervous stimulation. So once that AV node gets stimulated, the muscle itself can carry the electrical impulse. No other muscle in your body can do that. So the heart will even beat for a short time if it's removed from the body. Those nerve impulses are sent from the medulla oblongata to the heart's pacemaker, the sinoatrial node. And from there, it's carried by the muscle tissue to the AV node. The AV node is stimulated by the SA node. It sends nerve impulses to the ventricles along the septum, and this is through, well, I can't spell it, look at that. We'll go back one slide. There it is, Purkinje fibers. Okay, here's a diagram just relating the sounds of the heart to the actions of the heart. And here we go. Atrial contraction begins at the SA node. So our atria are going to contract. The impulse is delayed as the atria node. The impulse delays at the AV node. The ventricles are filled. The ventricle excitation happens at the apex. The bicuspid and tricuspid valves close, or we can say the AV valves close. Because those ventricles are contracting. As they contract, they slam those valves shut. The ventricle excitation is completed. It's going to open up. Where's my pen tip here? There we go. It's going to open the semilunar valves. As they relax, the semilunar valves close, and that's one full, cycle of a heartbeat. So the lub sound comes from the closing of the AV valves. The dub sound comes from the closing of the semilunar valves. So, how much blood does the heart actually pump? In order to measure that, we've got to take two things into consideration. The first is that cardiac output is determined by stroke volume and heart rate. The stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped with each beat of the heart. So how much blood leaves the heart every time it contracts? On average, that's about 70 milliliters, depending on the size of the person, the size of the heart. An average person just at rest, sitting around, not doing very much, has an average heart rate of 70 beats per minute. So every time the heart beats, it pumps 70 milliliters of fluid. It does that 70 times in 1 minute. So if we multiply the two numbers together, we get an average of about 4,900 milliliters per minute, which we're just going to round off to 5 liters per minute. So on average, the average heart pumps about 5 liters of blood per minute, depending again on body size and activity level. This is for an adult. For children, the volume would be different. Their stroke volume would be smaller, but their heart rate's also faster. So the volume can change depending on the age of the person, the activity level of the person, and the size of their heart. It will also fluctuate throughout the day. That's affected by the foods we eat, especially things like caffeine. Caffeine increases heart rate, whereas other foods will slow it down. Stress will increase heart rate. So your heart rate can change during the day, even if you're not moving around. Blood pressure is a measure of the pressure that blood is putting on all of those blood vessels in your body. So if there's too much pressure against a blood vessel, there's a chance that it will rupture or burst, and well, that's never a good thing. So the elastic connective tissue and the smooth muscle in the arteries stretch in order to accommodate the pressure every time the heart beats. So every time the heart beats, it pushes on blood vessels. The blood vessels stretch a little bit and then kind of push back on the blood, forcing it down the vessel. So that's what the recoil. Every time an artery gets a little bit of pressure, it recoils against the fluid, pushing it further down. It's measured by a device called a sphygmometer. And that's the cuff the doctor puts on your arm. And what happens is the first thing they do is they put that cuff on and they cut off blood circulation to the rest of your arm. So it feels really tight. It feels like it's going to squeeze your arm off. And what it's done is it's cut off blood flow to your arm. And then the pressure on the cuff is slowly loosened. As it's loosened, it gets to a point where it's now loose enough for the pressure from your heart pushing on the blood to actually push against the cuff and allow blood through. That first and that's going to make an audible sound. So as the cuff loosens, there's a low-pitched sound. This is the systolic blood pressure. It's the pressure the heart is putting on blood vessels every time it contracts. So the heart contracts, it pushes on the blood vessels in your arm, the blood vessels push on the cuff, and that is measured at a certain pressure. So the sound is going to continue until at some point it disappears. At the point it disappears is when the cuff is now loose enough that it's no longer pushing on your blood vessels. And so the blood vessels don't push on the cuff, and we lose the sound. That's the diastolic pressure, or the pressure that fluid is putting on blood vessels when the heart's not actively pushing it. So systolic and diastolic pressure, when you get your blood pressures, it's always going to be a large number, where's my pen here? So for example, 120 over say 60, and it's measured in kilopascals. And what this is the pressure, this would be the systolic pressure. This would be the diastolic pressure. And what that tells the person taking your blood pressure is how much force is being pushed against those blood vessel walls. If the numbers get too high, it means that the blood vessels are going to start wearing away. If the numbers get too low, it means the blood isn't being moved around your body quickly enough to provide oxygen to all the cells in your body. So the numbers being too high or being too low, neither is a good thing. And the blood pressure generally does drop as we move away from the heart. So the blood pressure, for example, in your wrist is going to be lower than the blood pressure in your arm or your upper arm, just because it's further away from your heart. Blood's been spread out a little bit more, so the pressure is going to be decreasing. Any factors that increase your cardiac output are also going to increase blood pressure. If your heart starts pushing more blood with each pump, then that's more force against the blood vessels. If it's pumping faster, it's also going to increase blood pressure because you're forcing more blood through the same vessel, but at a quicker rate. If the arterial resistance increases, then blood pressure will also increase. So for example, arterial resistance will increase if they are constricted. So blood pressure can be regulated by our body to a certain extent. If our blood pressure gets too low, it reduces the number of the amount of oxygen or nutrients that can be transported to the rest of our body. Extremely low blood pressure can cause organ starvation, because if the blood isn't getting out there quickly enough, then the organs themselves don't get enough oxygen or nutrients to function properly. If the blood pressure gets too high, it will rupture and break the blood vessels, causing blood to leak out into extracellular fluid, which will really just suffocate the cells that it pours into. The waste material can't come back out, and once that blood is starved of oxygen, no new blood can get to those cells. It's partially controlled by the nervous system. Inside of our blood vessels are baroreceptors. Those baroreceptors monitor blood pressure. They're located in the aorta and the carotid arteries. The carotid arteries, again, are underneath your collarbone. And they're sensitive to high blood pressure. If the pressure gets too high, then a nerve signal is sent to the medulla oblongata, and then the medulla oblongata sends a message out to your arteries, causing them to dilate. It relaxes the muscles inside of your arteries and causes them to get wider, and as they get wider, blood pressure is going to drop. If blood pressure is too low, same sort of idea. There'll be a message from your medulla oblongata that will cause arterioles to constrict. And so we're going to change this word here. And that will increase the blood pressure. The other part of our circulatory system we need to talk about is the fact that it's actually two circulatory systems. The heart is a set of pumps. It's separated by the septum. So the blood in the right side of the heart does not mix with the blood in the left side of the heart. So these two symptoms, or these two pumps, pump blood to different places. There's the pulmonary circulation, which is going to carry blood with no oxygen, deoxygenated blood, out to the lungs where it can get oxygen. Then it comes back to the heart. And then systemic circulation is going to carry that oxygenated blood, that blood that just came from the lungs, out to the rest of the body to lose oxygen. And then again, back to the heart. So blood actually travels through the heart twice to complete one circulation. Here's a diagram of it. If we just take a look at blood coming from the lungs. So here's a lung, the right lung, the left lung. We'll just look at the right lung for now. As blood gets pumped out to the lung, it gets out into the alveoli, and then there's gas exchange, right? This is going to be external respiration. The blood absorbs or gets oxygen. It travels back to the heart, where it enters the left atria. From the left atria, it goes into the left ventricle, and from the left ventricle, it goes out to the aorta. From the aorta is going to branch, and some blood is going to go up to the head and neck, and some blood is going to go down to your lower body, to your liver, intestines, kidneys, legs, all that kind of stuff. So that's all systemic circulation. Systemic circulation starts at the aorta. It goes out to your head and neck. It goes down to all your other organs. Notice it shows a capillary bed for gas exchange. So here, this is internal respiration. And if you take a look, internal respiration happens all over the place. It happens in your lower body. It happens in your kidneys. It happens in your liver. It happens in your head and neck. So all of these capillary beds are internal respiration. The blood is losing oxygen, and then it starts to pool back up into your veins. So the veins from your head and neck come back to your heart. The veins from all your lower organs come back to your heart. They pool in the right atria, and then they gather in the right ventricle. From the right ventricle, that deoxygenated blood is going to be pumped out to each lung. And this is the pulmonary circulation. So the pulmonary circulation is a pathway that involves both lungs. It comes from the right ventricle, goes out through the pulmonary arteries, and I've lost a bit of space. So these are the pulmonary arteries. And notice that here we have arteries carrying deoxygenated blood, or blood without oxygen. It carries the blood out to the lungs, it picks up oxygen, and back in through the pulmonary veins. And so each time blood has to go through the heart twice to complete one circuit through the body. So here's the print for the words I just used. The deoxygenated blood, I don't know why, but I always start at the right atrium and work my way through. You could start anywhere. You could start at the lungs, you could start at the right atrium or the left atrium. It's just a matter of preference. I always start with the deoxygenated blood going out to get oxygen. So deoxygenated blood is carried to the right atrium of the heart by veins. Superior vena cava carries blood from the head and brain. The inferior vena cava carries blood from the lower body. It passes through the AV valve, allowing blood to flow from the right atrium to the right ventricle. From there, the right ventricle is going to contract. It's going to push blood up into the pulmonary arteries. So it travels through a semilunar valve into the pulmonary arteries, and it travels out to each lung. To your lungs. The oxygenated blood is going to return to the left atrium of the heart through the pulmonary veins, and so this is from the lungs. It goes out to the lungs, it gets its oxygen, and returns to the heart at the left atrium, flows into the left ventricle. The left ventricle contracts, and again, it's going to flow through that AV valve that separates atriums from ventricles, atria from ventricles, and from the left ventricle, it's going to be pushed into the artery. And again, the backwash is prevented by the semilunar valve, pushed into the artery and out to our body. To the head and neck, it's going to lose oxygen, and then it comes back. The coronary arteries are special, or I shouldn't say they're special, but those are the arteries that provide nutrients to the heart. So they leave from the aorta, they supply the heart muscle with oxygenated blood so that it can actually do its work. So here's the pathway of blood. If we start the left atria, notice it's blue. Blue for no. I shouldn't say no, but we'll go this. This is better. Low O2. It's about 70% saturated with oxygen, which isn't enough. So from the left atria, it goes to the left ventricle, out to the pulmonary arteries, into the lungs where it gains oxygen, hence the color change here. We have low O2 to high O2. We've just picked up a bunch of oxygen. From the pulmonary veins, it goes to the right atria, to the right ventricle, out to the aorta, out to everything else, your body. And that's where it's going to lose O2. And so here we're back at a low O2 situation, back into the left atria, and we do it all over again. So this part here represents your heart. The valves aren't shown on there. There'd be an AV valve here and an AV valve here. And then as it flows from the left ventricle to the pulmonary arteries, we'd have a semilunar valve. And as it goes from the right ventricle to the aorta, we'd have another semilunar valve. So that's where the valves would sit in the picture. Both types of gas exchange are done through capillary beds. Or through capillaries. So the capillary bed here, where there's deoxygenation and also nutrients get transferred, here there is a capillary bed where we're going to have oxygenation and also a transfer of nutrients and waste. Here's just another picture of the heart. It's kind of a see-through picture of the heart. We can see the valves. So here's an AV valve. And here is a AV valve. Notice you have that chordate tendonae there showing attached to the valve itself. Here we have a semilunar valve and a semilunar valve. And so I just like it. It's a nice picture of the heart. Shows the relationship between the chambers and the blood vessels entering and leaving the heart. So from this lecture, you should have the idea that the heart is innervated with nervous tissue and it's stimulated by the medulla oblongata via the sinoatrial node. There's two circulatory systems. Pulmonary circulation involves the pulmonary arteries carrying blood to the lungs where it gets oxygen and then back to the heart via the pulmonary veins. Systemic circulation, the aorta transports blood out to the rest of the body where it loses oxygen, it's deoxygenated, and then it returns via the vena cava. Gases, nutrients, and waste are exchanged at capillary beds throughout the body.